Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the audience. Welcome to the webinar of Exploring Solutions for Myanmar Crisis Beyond ASEAN. This webinar is organized by Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Naifa Gizani Lagdo, and I will be acting as the host for this webinar. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to warmly greet several notable actors of our event today. I would like to first welcome Dr. Jose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, as he will be giving out the welcoming remarks for today. I will also want to express my greeting for several honorable attendants for this webinar. Thank you for Mr. Yusuf Wanandi, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of CSIS Foundation, Miss Clara Yuwono, Vice Chair of the Board of Directors CSIS Foundation, and Dr. Xavier F. Muhibat, the Deputy Executive Director for Research for CSIS Indonesia. I would like to thank you for their time to attend this webinar. I would like to also further deliver my greetings and welcome our speakers for today. Ms. Yun Sun, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. Dr. Constantino Xavier, that will be joining shortly, a Fellow and Foreign Policy and Security Center for Social and Economic Progress. Dr. Rizal Sukma, Senior Fellow for CSIS Indonesia, and Mr. Andrew Mantong, Researcher of CSIS Indonesia. We are humbled to be able to hear your perspectives and opinion given the timely topic and that we will be discussing today. And last but not least, welcome to all of the participants for the webinar who are attending today. Thank you for joining us. Now I will address briefly on our agenda. First, we will have a welcoming remarks by Dr. Jose Rizal Damuri, and will be followed by a panel session and discussion session that moderated by the head of Department of International Relations of CSIS Indonesia, Dr. Lina Alexandra. During the discussion session, all of the participants might deliver questions and or comments through Q&A feature provided by this Zoom session or chat box that from our YouTube. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Jose Rizal Damuri to give his welcoming remarks. For Dr. Jose, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Naifa. A very good morning to all of you, distinguished speakers and participants. My main task today is to welcome you, actually, to the CSIS Webinar, Exploring Solutions for Myanmar Crisis Beyond ASEAN. Special welcome for sure to all speakers in these forums who already willing to spare time to discuss these important but also challenging issues related to Myanmar. My special welcome to Dr. Constantino Xavier, Ms. Yun Sun, Dr. Rizal Sukma, and also Mr. Andrew Mantong, who already willing to spare time to speak and to share their knowledge and their opinions related to this issue. I think all of us know that the crisis has been going on for more than 1 year at the moment, but we still do not see any progress. The current last month UN report estimates that 14 out of 15 states are within the critical threshold of malnutrition in Myanmar. It is estimated that 15 million people actually will need some form of aid and assistance during this crisis. So basically, this crisis has brought a lot of suffering to the people of Myanmar. But in addition to this agony to the Myanmar people, actually the crisis in Myanmar also have a lot of regional implications, including, for example, how ASEAN has handled the issues that might also indicate how ASEAN is prepared for this kind of situations. There is also an underlying concerns whether this crisis in Myanmar may become an arena for competitions among the major power in Indo-Pacific. So this crisis is really important, and we need to deal with that more carefully. ASEAN already has done several initiatives, like, for example, the Cambodia, as the current chair, ASEAN chair, has appointed special envoy to continue ASEAN efforts in dealing with the crisis. ASEAN's also already give sanctions by not allowing representative from Myanmar to come to ASEAN meetings. But however, it's still that the ASEAN still need to do more to facilitate facilitate more discussions and peaceful dialogues among the conflicting parties in Myanmar. Today, we will discuss how the solutions to the crisis might also come from outside the regions. All the speakers here will explore how collaboration between ASEAN and regional powers can actually lead to progress on dealing with Myanmar issues. There has been only limited conversation, unfortunately, on how ASEAN dialogue partners with direct interest to Myanmar can provide leverage and also provide capacities. Actually, that is very quite important aspect that we need in dealing with this Myanmar crisis. Thus, through this webinar, I hope we can discuss those various possible alternatives, and the speakers can also share their knowledge, their thoughts about how these collaborations between ASEAN and other major powers in the regions can contribute greatly to the diplomatic effort in resolving the crisis in Myanmar. I look forward to a deep and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much, and I hand over the screen back to Navia.
Thank you for your insightful remarks, Dr. Gyose. It served well for our knowledge on the topic for the upcoming session. And I have noticed that Dr. Constantino Xavier is already on the panel. So I would like to give the screen to Dr. Lina Alexander to moderate our discussion today. Dr. Lina, you may have the screen.
Thank you, Naifa. Once again, a warm welcome from CSIS. Thank you for all the speakers as well as the participants who attend this meeting today, this morning with us. So basically, this webinar is part of the policy paper writing project and policy workshop on Myanmar crisis and regional security in Indo-Pacific. It is actually part of CSIS Myanmar Initiative program that we have organized since last year in CSIS. If you look at the title, it's probably quite controversial because we clearly mentioned how we would like to discuss about exploring solutions for Myanmar crisis beyond ASEAN. If you look at the current condition of the crisis in Myanmar, I think it is quite clear that there has no significant progress of implementation of the 5-point consensus after it has been applied almost 1 year. And recently, with the visit from the special envoy, Mr. Prak Sokhonn, to meet with the representative from the military junta in Myanmar just last week, there has been some talks about setting up the humanitarian corridor and humanitarian coordination meeting, as well as setting up the ASEAN Troika to monitor the implementation of the 5-point consensus. but we don't know whether this process actually involves or has already involved all stakeholders in Myanmar, as we have not seen the special envoy talking with other stakeholders other than the SAC representative or the military junta. And what is quite shocking, actually, the military junta, they underline that the process of implementing 5-point consensus should be Myanmar owned and Myanmar led, whatever that means, of course. So far, I think we all quite aware about some emerging question, whether there is a necessity to think of an alternative solution or alternative path beyond ASEAN or beyond 5-point consensus, whether we should move on from the 5-point consensus in order to reach to the effective solution to the crisis. Non-fellows, of course, we need to explore some follow-up questions, at least 3. First, what would be the bordering limit for the 5-point consensus or ASEAN? For the international community to say enough, and we need to move on from a 5-point consensus. Second, how and to what extent the relevant non-ASEAN actors would be ready and interested to involve more in pushing for a solution to the Myanmar crisis. And the third, of course, for us in Indonesia, Indonesia will soon assume the position as the ASEAN chair next year. What will Indonesia need to prepare from now to anticipate the increasing pressure against ASEAN? Without further ado, I would like to allow we have now 4 excellent speakers with us. Also, some of the contributors and paper writers for the policy paper that discuss about the impact of the Myanmar crisis to the regional security in Indo-Pacific. We have here now with us Dr. Rizal Sukma, our senior fellow in CSIS, and also our Indonesian ambassador to UK, Ireland, and international maritime organizations in 2016 and 2020. We have Ms. Yunsun, the senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program in Stimson Center. And we also have Dr. Constantino Xavier, the fellow in foreign policy and security in the Center for Social and Economic Progress. And last but not least, we also have Mr. Andrew Mantong, the researcher in the Department of International Relations in CSIS. I would like now to give the first floor to Ambassador Rizal Sukma to probably speak up a little bit about, of course, the points on your paper, but also touching upon the recent condition that we are facing in Myanmar, basically, and also discuss about some question whether we need to move on beyond the 5-point consensus and ASEAN. Please, Dr. Rizal.
Thank you so much, Lina. Good morning to everyone. It's good evening to Yunsun. I will not speak very long, so you can, retire, because I know that it's quite late in DC. But of course, we all actually looking forward to, listening to your views and suggestions and ideas and how to actually address this particular, I think, delicate, issue that ASEAN and in fact, most of us face over the last, I think, year or so. And also, thank you, Pa Jose and Pa Yusuf, Bu Clara, who also joined the discussion. So I think we all still concerned about the developments in Myanmar, and then hope that we can continue to focus our attention on Myanmar despite what happened in Ukraine and another part of the world. Because, as I mentioned in a number of our discussion over the last, year or so, one of my worries is actually, people move on, the attention move on, because so many problems, in the world at the moment, and then, Myanmar issue become an issue of the past. But I think we try to focus and also try to engage a lot of people in order to make sure that Myanmar is still an issue that we all need to think about and pay attention to. My paper is basically, trying to look at the role of ASEAN and or the policy options available, for ASEAN in dealing with the coup, in Myanmar. It's basically, in the paper I outlined a number of options, but it all actually try to answer one particular questions, on how to respond and change what happened, in Myanmar since the 1st of February 2021. And then, of course, we have had a number of options like sanction, for example, but we all know that it has not actually produced any change, on the ground, and the junta still, control Myanmar. They're still there, and then the democratically elected groups, the CRPH and the NUG are still, I think, on the defensive because of the assault, and violent assault by the junta in Myanmar. Then we also often talk about the R2P, and we know that there is no appetite from the international community to invoke the R2P. So R2P again is not viable options to solve the Myanmar problem. And of course, one of the most talked about approach is actually engagement. How you engage the actors in Myanmar, especially the military. But that's, I think, also raised one particular very difficult problem, which is disengagement might confer a degree of legitimacy and also display an acceptance of the junta's rule in Myanmar. And then ASEAN try to combine that engagement with other approach as well. So it's basically a combination of stick and carrots, of ASEAN, try to persuade actors in Myanmar in order to really solve the problem. And that led to the so-called 5 points consensus at the moment. But the problem is really then, of course, in the past we discussed a lot, why not much has changed, since the decision by ASEAN, to come up with the 5-point consensus. So it's simply because there have been a lot of, I think, papers, articles written on this one, simply because the implementation by ASEAN has no coherent strategy and details plan. And most important of all, I think we still have not agreed on what is the key objective that we want to achieve, in Myanmar, what ASEAN wants to achieve. Because you have two options here. One, stability or order, and the other one is democracy. Some basically want to see, that stability and order can be achieved by, restoring the democracy in Myanmar, which means the junta, should stop and then should, continue, give power back, to the elected government, and so on. But order and stability also means that it doesn't matter who is in power, as long as there was no more killing, no more, arrest, no more torture, and so on, then that would be good enough, especially, for regional stability. So, but, I think ASEAN has not actually formulated, one overarching, commonly agreed objective, whether order, stability on the one hand, or you want, democracy. But, by saying that democracy will lead to order and stability is not enough. It's not a strategy, it's not a plan, but more or less it is a hope, So, and then I think I don't think that you can solve Myanmar problem with hope. Second point that I would like to make is actually, as the ASEAN, approach, is facing this uncertainty and so on because of the absence of the coherent strategy, no plan, and also clumsy implementation. But I think, we look at, again, the role of external powers. And here, I think there is not much also change that, the external powers, can actually produce, in Myanmar. And in fact, all external powers, put their hope on ASEAN, that the ASEAN 5-point consensus would somehow, work and then resolve the problem in Myanmar. So what we are seeing at the moment is basically a degree of normalization of junta's rule. So more or less people become, get acquainted to what is on the ground, what is the reality, where, the junta, present themselves as the only power that really control the country, and so on. So because of that, this is my third point, that ASEAN really needs to sit and discuss some kind of joint action with the non-ASEAN extra-regional powers, and try to formulate a new approach. Of course, the current approach, which is based on the 5-point consensus, should continue, and ASEAN should continue to explore ways to implement it. But I think when we sit and also try to bring in the extra-regional powers, like China, India, and other powers, the US and the EU and Japan, then there is one key question that we need to ask. If this initiative should be based on the 5-point consensus. We know that the 5-point consensus basically is only 3 important things that ASEAN want to achieve. Number 1, stop the violence. Number 2, deliver the humanitarian assistance. Number 3, the all-inclusive dialogue among the parties in Myanmar. So the questions now is that how you approach these 3 key issues, key plan. Should we just go straight to number 3 and then try to work with the extra-regional powers to persuade and, if necessary, put pressure on the parties in Myanmar to sit together and then have an inclusive dialogue? Or should the 3 go in parallel? And then if it does, and then what sort of things that we need to do with the extra-regional powers, so that at the same time there should be an external power that can put pressure on the junta to stop the killing, stop the arrest, stop the torture, but at the same time there should also be those extra-regional powers or dialogue partners of ASEAN who can actually deliver the humanitarian assistance, and then those who specifically work to help ASEAN to facilitate the all-inclusive dialogue in order to find a negotiated solution. So I think these are the things that we really need to find an answer to, and then try to find ways to work with the extra-regional powers. So ASEAN should also tell the extra-regional powers that giving the support to the 5-point consensus and ASEAN role is not enough. We really need the dialogue partners to together with ASEAN to become actually, I think parties to this initiative to try to affect change in Myanmar. So I think I will stop there, because otherwise I can talk more and on so Yun Sun cannot go to sleep. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pak Rizal. You actually still have 1 more minute. Sorry, I forgot to tell the speakers that you have 10 minutes speaking time. Anyway, I think it's very clear, the message from Pak Rizal, 3 points. First, of course, ASEAN has not reached to the agreement about the key objective about what they want to achieve with the Myanmar crisis, whether it's democracy restoration or just simply no more violence on the ground, basically stability. Second, of course, regarding the role of the external powers, not much changed on the ground so far, and it's just simply hoping that the 5-point consensus will work. And the third, very important recommendation, I think, is for ASEAN to join hand in hand with the extra-regional powers to really become the real actors on the ground to push for the key points of the 5-point consensus to be implemented very soon in Myanmar. So with that, I would like to allow Ms. Yun Sun to give your presentation, also 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, and thanks to Ambassador Rizal. I would love for you to continue to share with us your wisdom, because I think your wisdom is so much more important and also insightful in this case. Because if the question that I was posed is that what is China's approach, or what China is really doing to solve this crisis, and I thought really hard, and my answer is not much. And I think as a theme, the Chinese approach is also trying to put more distance between China and the military junta for reputational concerns, and also for political concerns, and also for the concerns about the future political changes in Myanmar. And therefore, I would say that what we have seen more out of China is a desire for detachment and a desire for distancing itself from Myanmar. So I really do not observe many signs of the Chinese enthusiasm or Chinese actions in terms of mediation or in terms of even facilitation of dialogues in the country. So just to develop my my argument, I will also make 3 points. The first one is about the political relations between China and Myanmar after the coup. Second one is under what conditions will China change its position and adopt a more progressive or hands-on approach in Myanmar. And the third point is about whether the economics really matter here. Given the isolation of the Burmese junta, is China exploiting the opportunity? First, in terms of the political relations, I have to say that the political relations between China and the military junta has been very cold. That last time there was any senior level visit, it was before the coup in January of 2021, when the Chinese foreign minister visited in January, and basically within 10 days, Myanmar had a coup. And it put China in a very embarrassing position. The most noticeable visitor from China to Myanmar was Chinese Special Envoy for Asian Affairs, Sun Guoxiang, who before the coup was carrying responsibility for the mediation between the Burmese government and the ethnic armed groups. So he visited in August of last year. And one of his key missions is to request a meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi. And he reportedly stayed in Naypyidaw for a whole week, waiting for Myanmar Line to grant him the access. And in the end, he was not. So you could imagine that there's a dissatisfaction or the displeasure that this has created in China about the military government. It's also a manifestation of the reservation, I would say tremendous reservation that China has towards the junta. Two signs, at least 2 pieces of convincing evidence. The first one is at UN, the ambassador appointed by the previous NLD government, Zhou Mo-tun, was allowed to continue his post. And from the Chinese perspective, one argument is that Zhou Mo-tun is the ambassador selected by the last legitimate government in Myanmar, which is the NLD government. So in that sense, the military junta is not legitimate, but from the Chinese perspective, the legitimacy of NUG to represent the country is also not tested by general elections. So Zhou Mo-tun represents the most legitimate appointment from Myanmar. So that's why he is being allowed to stay. Another example is in November last year, when China and ASEAN countries had their summit. It was a virtual online summit. The Chinese tacitly approved for ASEAN to exclude Myanmar from that summit. So in the virtual summit, you see the Chinese leader with 9 ASEAN country leaders, but without the Burmese leader. And that's another example of the reservation that China has about the legitimacy of the junta. I think this also says a lot about China's hopes that ASEAN would play a bigger role or play the main role, like Ambassador Rizal has already elaborated. According to a summary by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in December last year, as a summary of the Chinese foreign policy of the year, he basically said that, well, China has supported Myanmar's cooperation with ASEAN and Myanmar to gradually and step by step implement the 5-point consensus. And China opposes intervention or improper intervention by external forces. But the problem is, I think the Chinese understand very well the inconsistency or the disagreements within ASEAN about the issue of Myanmar. And I think it's also quite clear that China has not actively adopted any policy to try to reduce, let alone eliminate those disagreements. I think this is primarily because the Chinese have 2 disbeliefs. The first one is that they don't believe that external intervention or external pressure can really change the domestic politics in Myanmar. The changes will have to happen from within, and it will it also has to come organically. And that's the second disbelief, which is that the development of the Burmese domestic politics has not come to that natural turning point. Well, last time it took almost 70 years for that to happen. So for Beijing, although it is true that the Taliban, the Burmese military, needs to reassess its role and expectations of its own role in the Burmese politics, the other political forces in Myanmar will also need to give what they call realistic and sufficient consideration of the future role of the Burmese military in the politics. A Burmese military junta, of course, is not legitimate and is not reasonable. But on the other hand, to try to exclude the Burmese military from the politics and to completely subject the military under the civilian government's leadership and control is also unrealistic. Eventually, a negotiation or a compromise is required. But so far, it appears that, well, 14 months into the coup, none of the political parties is ready or position themselves for concession. Second question, under what conditions will China change its position and adopt a more direct intervening approach, especially given that we have seen the multi-layered internal chaos and internal crisis that we're seeing in Myanmar, not only the humanitarian crisis, but also the public health crisis, and also the not only the civil military contest for power, but also the Burma as a majority group and the ethnic minorities, the fighting on the ethnic front has also been escalating. So when China looks at the internal instability in Myanmar, basically deteriorating on a daily basis, is China going to adopt a more hands-on and assertive approach to intervene? Well, on that, I would say that the answer is not really positive, or at least the history does not inspire confidence, because for the more than 70 years of civil war in Myanmar, China has not intervened in Myanmar because of civil military political contest for power. We have even seen that China using its veto power at the UN Security Council back in 2007 against using the against UN Security Council having a resolution to sanction the Burmese military government at the time. The recent year, we have seen more signs of the Chinese intervention or the Chinese involvement in Myanmar, but most of them have been due to the instability along the border region. So one example is back in 2015, when the Kokand conflict flared up, and it was sending not only refugees into China, it also led to the Burmese military's shelling of Chinese territory, because while the ethnic groups were running into China to take refuge, and the Burmese military were chasing after them, and they were using shelling and they were using airstrikes against the ethnic groups, and inevitably they hit Chinese territory and they killed the Chinese civilians. And that's when we saw the Chinese staged live fire drills along the border in order to force the conflict to a stop. That's one example in recent years. And another example that we saw in the Rakhine state back in 2017 was that the Chinese were not happy with the Rakhine crisis, and the Chinese, in fact, has used its military aid as a leverage to demand the Burmese military to have a ceasefire, and it was also successful. So, but in both cases, these are about ethnic minorities. These are not about the civil military contest. And so I'm not really positive that China will take a more assertive role. Last but not least, the last question about the economic relations. So there had been this argument that now Myanmar is so isolated and China is going to use this opportunity to absorb Myanmar into the Chinese orbit. The data doesn't support it. So for the first 6 months after the coup, the foreign direct investment from China into Myanmar dropped by more than 50%. So we could see this visible impact of political instability on economic relations between China and Myanmar. And in terms of the trade, we don't have the full year data from 2021 just yet. It seems that for the first 6 months, the trade was remaining stable. But if we look at the data from, for example, last October to this earlier to January this year, the trade has also decreased very significantly. From compared year-to-year comparison, the trade in the previous year was during those 3.5 months from October to January. The previous year it was almost almost $2 billion. But for this past year, during those same period, the border trade between Myanmar and China was only somewhere around $360 million. So the border trade has decreased for more than, I would say, 80% during the year-to-year comparison. And people could have different, there could be different explanations. So for example, COVID and the border closure has had a major impact over the border trade. But we also know that a lot of the agricultural products, for example, Myanmar exports to China, a lot of that is conducted through the border. So the border trade has been really affected between the two countries. We're not seeing a significant increase in terms of the economic relations between the two, and I doubt that China will be interested in throwing its resources into the country with a very uncertain political and economic future. Thank you.
All right.
And I have to apologize. I'm going to excuse myself. We have a 9-month-old baby who is still crying in bed. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. If you have questions, you know where to find me, and I'm always happy to participate in CSIS Indonesia's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yunsun. Very insightful presentation. I think a lot of things to take from you. Again, 3 points, very key important points. I think against all odds, of course, the political relations between the Chinese government and the State Administration Council, the military junta, is getting even more cold now, as Yunsun mentioned. And it has been indicated by the implicit support, for example, by letting the previous Myanmar representative to the UN to stay in his position, and also China is clearly having no any strong reaction against an empty seat from the SAC in the ASEAN China summit meeting. And also, I think it's quite clear that China is understand about the there's a pressure for China to change the position, of course, but the real condition is not. I think currently are not really enough for China to change its position unless there might be some in the future instability at the borders. But I think even China react to that, it will be still a limited response, because China will prefer to see changes from within, or organic change from within Myanmar itself rather than being pushed from outside. And the third, against the thinking that Myanmar will be absorbed to Chinese orbit, the data doesn't say so. The data says the investment, the trade relations has been decreased because or being impacted severely by the current crisis, the political crisis that we are facing in Myanmar currently. I think a very strong, a very key message. And once again, thank you, Yunsun, for your presentation. We will convey if there's any urgent question that you need to respond. Thank you very much. Now, I will like to give the floor to Dr. Constantino Xavier. Thank you, first of all, to join us as well. So you also have 10 minutes, Tino, to give presentation, please.
Thank you, Lina. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see you all here from Delhi. And thank you for CSIS Indonesia for hosting this. This is really a very timely and relevant project that I've been very pleased and honored to join with a small contribution on India's role and wonderful to hear also Ambassador Rizal Sukma open up this discussion with, I think, a very pragmatic approach. If I may say so, a bit disappointing to see where we are now. We've been meeting, I think, over the last few months, right? And I think we're all becoming a bit restless in terms of course, not the situation only in Myanmar, but also the lack of options, the lack of implementation of what had been taught in July, August last year. I think last summer, early last year, there was a bit of hope, a certain momentum that I sense has or may have disappeared, but keen to also hear from others what they think about that. The brief that I sent in for the publication for this project really shows that India is an important, but I would say relatively marginal actor to this, and that's the perception I sense across Southeast Asia. China has certainly been much more involved. The US less involved than it was in the 2000s and in previous crises, but certainly more involved than India. And the main reason for this is that the last 10 years were the best years in India-Myanmar relations in almost 70 years, since the 1950s. In fact, from 1950 to 1962, those were the initial very productive years in India-Burma relations. And then it was almost 50 years of stagnation of relations with occasional ups, but very short ups and mostly downs. So I think one needs to understand that the coup came as a counter-cyclical moment in India-Myanmar relations. These were excellent relations on the economic front. This is the first time that India and Myanmar in decades were fleshing out economic corridors, connectivity on the land border. This is when India and Myanmar strengthened their defense relationship, including through India training Myanmar defense officials, India supporting with hardware the Tatmadaw. This was also 10 years where India supported the democratic process in Myanmar through training of parliamentary staff, political leaders in Myanmar who came for India for training in elections and parliamentary procedures. So India was deeply involved on the economic, security, military, and political front in that country over the last 10 years. And therefore, the coup came in general as a negative development that interrupted that. But at the same time, those 10 years, and particularly the last few years, 3 to 4 years, were built again on a strong military-to-military relationship and on India strengthening its outreach to the army in Myanmar, precisely because of the perception that the NLD was overall weakening, that the NLD had been overall unable to deepen the democratic process, a sense of disappointment about the Rakhine refugee crisis and how the democratic government in Myanmar dealt with that, and the political leaders of the various parties in Myanmar, and overall also certain delay in some projects. But that sort of shifting of India's attention towards the generals made it more difficult for India to respond to the coup in a strong and substantive manner. That does not mean that India was the first country that actually came out with a very strong statement expressing its disappointment, and has since then repeatedly and in more intense ways described its disappointment, its demand for all political prisoners to be released, its demand or request for Myanmar to really restore the democratic process as soon as possible. But since then, that's why I began with the first point. I think late last year, we've seen a bit of a slowdown, I think. India has tried to have its cake and eat it too. I think that the overall sense that ASEAN was not able to perform led India also to reinitiate a bilateral outreach. The Foreign Secretary of India, Harsh Shringla, who's the senior most diplomat in the Ministry of External Affairs here, visited Myanmar in December. This was one of the few, and probably the highest level visit from other countries to Myanmar. It was an official visit. He met Min Aung Hlaing and several other officials. And there's two ways to read that statement, the statements that came out of it in that visit, which was really significant. One way, of course, is if you look at the junta's statements, they're very different from the Indian ones. They see this visit as one that legitimized their rule and their control. But there's an alternative reading, which I think I would support if you look very carefully at the Indian statement, is that India communicated quite closely and directly its disappointment in the lack of progress, its disappointment in the lack of domestic order, its disappointment in the Myanmar military being unable to control its northern areas, particularly in Rakhine, Sagaing regions that have been affecting India's own security across the border, and therefore a certain urgency from the Indian side to do this. Now, I mentioned bilateral because what's interesting is that India took this decision informally consulting with other countries, but it really went on its own to do this. And why do I find this interesting? In some ways, interesting, but also maybe telling of the lack of collective action from ASEAN and other countries is that India went on this, did this on its own without really coordinating with ASEAN, the US, maybe China, of course, difficult relations now between India and China. But this, I think, shows a certain exasperation on the Indian side that there's been little or no movement in conflict resolution and actual concrete possibilities led by ASEAN or any other actor. And therefore, India went on to engage bilaterally with this visit to Myanmar in December. Now, if you look at the three sectors that India really thinks of when it's looking at Myanmar, it is the cross-border security. India has been trying to stabilize its northeastern states, where there are active insurgencies, often with support, operational support, and even bases located in Myanmar that frequently cross the border. This has been a concern for India for many years, but there is again a sense of concern about the unsustainable, or let's say on the progressive destabilization of northern Myanmar with unprecedented levels of violence and the inability of the Tatmadaw to control those groups. There have been attacks, a growth in number of attacks on the Indian side of the border. So there's a certain impatience and concern on that front. The second one is the economic one. Here again, all the connectivity projects, including the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway, a multimodal port, river and road access route from the state of Mizoram in India to the port of Sitwe in Myanmar. All of these have slowed down, if not stopped completely. So this is, again, I think, a primary concern for India. Also due to international sanctions by the US and Europe in particular, India had to cancel, or one private Indian company had to cancel one major investment in a port just outside Yangon. This was the Adani Group in India that was trying to build a container terminal there, which was very important for India's economic strategy to link through shipping routes with Myanmar. And third, on the geostrategic front, things are not as bad because I think, as Yun Sun just shared, the assessment here also in Delhi is that China has not been able to fill a so-called vacuum or has stepped in and has tremendously benefited from the situation. In that sense, I think India and China share or are on the same boat in terms of their reluctance to engage, but also their concern about the situation in Myanmar and their perception also that, getting too close may bring reputational costs. But I think there again, India is also worried that more than China filling the vacuum, which was a past worry in the past and has been often a concern. The concern is actually that nobody is filling the vacuum, that nobody is taking the lead, the initiative to deal, to hold either the junta's hand or the democratic opposition, or to find a mediation resolution. So it's the worst case scenario because really no one is taking the initiative. No one is ensuring some type of order or control from outside over the junta or any political process there in that country. So I think in terms of the solutions of how India looks at this, therefore looking forward now, one thing very clear for India is that the military plays a central role. The junta is, of course, not desirable in its current form and certainly should not stay on for long, but that there will be no solution, whatever solution we find for Myanmar, without the military involved in any format, formally, informally, but that the Tatmadaw today remains, however weakened or not, a center of power in Myanmar, and that will therefore need to be listened to, engaged, and dealt with. That's point number one, from which, in fact, India often diverges with some of its Western partners. Number two is that on the opposition, again, we have another vacuum, if you want. That is a perception here in India, that despite the NUG's attempt to diversify its outreach, shed its Bamar centrality, its NLD centrality, again, there's a vacuum there with Aung San Suu Kyi out of the game pretty much now. In terms of leadership, whether charismatic or not, but also in terms of structure and presence across the country. And in fact, the NUG's decision to support the People Defense Forces and violent, if you want, or armed struggle has further concerned India and has further, if you want, delegitimized in some ways the NUG in India's eyes. And that is a problem because there's really a vacuum there of who to deal with in the opposition, and who can, and therefore, who can really sit at the table to represent the variety of constituencies in Myanmar towards any solution and to engage the Tatmadaw internally towards that solution. The third aspect that India is concerned about, I'll end at that, Lina, is the external guarantees. Nothing will work. I think Yun Sun mentioned rightly that the onus is on the internal political solution. But while that is a necessary condition, it's not sufficient. Nothing will work in Myanmar without external guarantees, external initiatives, and external push. And I think, yeah, Indonesia's upcoming ASEAN chairmanship will be very important in that sense, because for India's perspective, the relations with Indonesia have been improving. And there's a certain, I think, keenness here in Delhi to let Indonesia play a much more active role to find some solution for Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tino. Again, very valuable and interesting points that Tino mentioned. I think it's very clear. First, of course, India is an important but still largely marginal external power in the crisis. And it is very clear from your presentation that India actually really pay attention to the lacking of ASEAN's progress so far. So that's why India made some initiative as well, although it's still bilateral, because it's clear India has certain interests. And I mean, because of the crisis, there are certain interests are being impacted as well from the Indian side. And then the 3 points that you mentioned, I think is very clear, and like supporting what Yun Sun mentioned earlier, as you said, to some extent, there should be a kind of negotiation on the ground among these political actors in order to reach to certain more sustainable solution. Second, the NLD absence, the rise of the People's Defense Forces, certainly, and plus also other domestic actors in Myanmar. I think that really complicate the situation to really define who should actually talk with whom, right? And the third is, of course, I think that it is very clear message as well as the external powers would like to see more of an internal development in Myanmar to create a kind of entry point on how these external actors can actually play certain role in mitigating or even solving the crisis. Thank you, Tino. So last but not least, of course, our own researcher, Andrew Mantong, to also coordinate the project and also share a lot of his views as well. So Andrew, also 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Lina. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, thank you. It's been wonderful hearing presentations from Dr. Rizal Sukma and then Ms. Yun Sun and Dr. Constantino Xavier. Since I've also worked these several months reading their works, also with another authors who've been working on other countries, like, for example, Japan, South Korea, and then working on specific issues related to regional security implications of the Myanmar crisis in the region, including the refugee crisis, COVID-19 and human security, illicit arms trade, as well as wildlife, and then the issues of arms transfer. What would be the general finding of the entire readings that I gather from the entire workshop? I would begin by scoping the problem of the security crisis occurring since the coup in February, as well as the sort of convergence and divergence found across differences in countries' positions towards the crisis, especially on ASEAN dialogue partners' attitude toward the crisis. And then I would try to sort of gather the common denominator found on works done by the authors by providing some recommendations for the future of finding solutions beyond ASEAN for dealing with Myanmar crisis. The scope of the problem. Next slide. Next slide. Yes, the scope of problems for today's crisis is of course the coup and the disruption of both hybrid government and economic openness in Myanmar. But there are some longer duration sources of problem which is related to problematic state and nation building in Myanmar. What would be the main important point here is that we are learning day by day that military in Myanmar is rather different from the military in Indonesia, when during the authoritarian era, they are used to be able to learn about how to deal and manage with state administrative purposes. In Myanmar, military is only used to fight, and they think that state building project as well as nation building project is about homogenizing society through the coercive apparatus. So this is the sources of probably most of the political problem in Myanmar crisis that lead eventually to the recent coup. And from the regional perspective, we have slow ASEAN responses, especially on the implementation of the ASEAN 5 points consensus. For ASEAN this year, especially for Indonesia next year as the chair of the ASEAN, is the questions of what will happen if the election in Myanmar will take place next year. The election will be taking place when Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN. And if the implementation of the ASEAN 5-point consensus does not really transform into a real manifestation in the ground of Myanmar, we will be facing a hard questions of whether and how and to what extent we can actually welcome the result of the election of the Myanmar, since ASEAN already decided that we don't want to invite political leaders to the ASEAN summits. There would be the major policy problems here. And what would be the general findings of the readings towards the works done by the authors? Next slide. We find the entire project find that general overview towards ASEAN dialogue partners' responses to the crisis might indicate that there are rooms for common denominator, especially from those of Asian countries, which are dialogue partners of ASEAN. However, the most striking feature found across countries' perspective and policy direction so far is that all countries' policies throw the ball back to ASEAN. They are all aware of both cost and geopolitical calculation, as well as developmental risk. They don't want to replicate the failure of the United States war on terror in Iraq, and therefore their action will make ASEAN back at the center of the platform to deal with the crisis. And regional powers may unite around ASEAN along with its 5-point consensus, not necessarily because they think that it can work, but because ASEAN can provide a platform where both cost and risk can be minimized. And the general mapping of these policies can be seen in the following table. Next slide. Both convergences and next slide. Both convergences of and the divergences of ASEAN dialogue partners in Indo-Pacific, as discussed by our authors in the first part of our report, can be summarized in the table. They are differentiated by the various kind of policy adopted by different countries, concerns mainly involved in their approaches to the crisis, feasible actions to be actors to be engaged, and most instrumental tools that can be utilized to implement their policy to the crisis. If you look carefully at the table, you can find that there are some room for what has been Dr. Xavier called as a collective action, a solution to the collective action problems. Policies, if you look carefully, are differentiated between principles, democracy and human rights in one edge of the spectrum, and non-interference at the other edge of the spectrum, as well as the interest in a security realm, either direct or indirect. At the one end of the spectrum of the principle, China maintains principle of non-interference, which consequently put forces and direct interventions of the table of Beijing approach to Myanmar. While South Korea tends to adopt an opposite principle, since Seoul, among ASEAN regional powers, adopts more explicit stance on democracy, including sanctions, closer to Western countries' stance towards the crisis. In the middle of the spectrums are India and Japan, who adopt more ambivalent positions toward democracy and non-interference issues here. However, the most important feature of these convergences is that every country wants immediate stability and a fully effective working government in Myanmar with broader base of legitimacy. While their attitudes towards the Tatmadaw and the NUG may differ from one another, they all may believe that deals and negotiations should lead to ultimate solutions to the crisis, making each country an essential supporter of ASEAN needs in implementing the 5-point consensus, especially on the point of inclusive dialogue in Myanmar. Interestingly, common position between China, India, and Japan with regards to their engagement with the military may open room for coordinative actions with ASEAN to compel the military to engage and agree on the commencement of dialogue. At the same time, ASEAN must work harder to build rapport with the NUG, and it can also follow direction as led by the South Korea to work with ASEAN and other Western countries in ensuring that NUG can also be engaged in the dialogue and immediate cessation of violence also effectively taking place in Myanmar. And if you look at the last lines of the tables, diplomatic tools found across these countries' policy may provide an engine needed by ASEAN to harmonize sticks and carrots approaches to Myanmar. As revenues and resources are needed by different political forces in Myanmar today, from Tatmadaw, a PDF, and ethnic arms organization, a collaboration between ASEAN and its dialogue partners may complement broader policy taken by Western countries, especially in terms of sanction. Here, ASEAN should be more creative in utilizing both bilateral contacts as well as support from multilateral agencies such as the United Nations. And how do we address the security challenge in Myanmar today? Next slide. Different problems require different solutions to the crisis. While problems of the refugee might only be addressed mostly in short time period by ASEAN, ensuring that dialogue will eventually lead to the creations of government in multi-ethnic Myanmar demands a long-term perspective of ASEAN work in Myanmar. COVID-19, for example, requires rapid and immediate response from well-coordinated ASEAN. But also the problems in Myanmar at the same time are rooted in weak performances of the state in terms of provisions of health and public goods. And this problem is worsened by the eroded trust between state and different societies in Myanmar. And problem of illicit activities are mostly connected to the longer durations of political economy formation between contending political forces in Myanmar, as well as demand, access, and supplies from Myanmar, from the neighboring countries of Myanmar. To deal with this array of problems, there are some recommendations already found in the work. For example, Elina Noor mentioned that solving refugees problem requires certain roles of Bangladesh, while dealing with timber trade as well as drug trafficking requires framework beyond ASEAN that engage what has been called by Richard Horsey as long-standing international markets, such as Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and more recent emerging markets such as Bangladesh and India. One of the most important platforms to be engaged by ASEAN is proposed by Dr. Yukiko Nishikawa from Japan, who specifically mentioned that ASEAN +3 mechanism would be an example of potential frameworks to organize support and find a room for maneuver beyond non-interference principle. An ASEAN-led mechanism that engages ASEAN with dialogue partners, according to other authors, might be more useful as compared to symbolic UN arms embargo, since ASEAN can work especially with India, Russia, and China to produce what David Scott Mathieson called as an arms supply restraint mechanism. Next slide. There would be some recommendations if we depart from these general writings. First, ASEAN must find a working formula to engage with China, India, and Japan, especially to push military to open dialogue with all contending parties. Labeling NUG as terrorists here, as done by Tetmado, would be a most important challenge. But given the ties that Japan, India, and China maintains with the military, I think there would be some stick and carrot can be accommodated if we do the coordinative action between ASEAN and dialogue partners. And Korea's second, ASEAN must also engage with NUG through coordinative manners. Support from countries like Korea, along with ASEAN portfolio of dealing with internal conflict, such as those of Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, may constitute a good combination of the incentive and ideas to attract trust on dialogues from opposition in Myanmar. Third, as mandated by the ASEAN 5-point consensus, immediate cessation of violence and constructive dialogue plays a pivotal role in determining further solutions. Due to the principle of non-intervention, ASEAN countries tend to fix their view on the notion that we all eventually let Myanmar people decide its own future. But if there is no formal mechanism, even within the ASEAN Plus mechanism or the East Asian Summit, ASEAN leaders should begin to launch informal mechanism. What I would personally like to propose here is that ASEAN leaders, ASEAN primus inter pares leaders, like for example Indonesia, should begin the initiative of establishing informal mechanism to engage different actors in Myanmar. Not only we should refer to the example of post-Nargis Myanmar, we should also refer to the example of Jakarta informal meeting as done by Indonesia and other ASEAN countries in dealing with Cambodia crisis and Cambodia war with the Vietnamese. And the last recommendations is that ASEAN requires terms of reference and office or mission exclusively deployed in Myanmar, since working with different layers of governance as well as different actors with different tools require clear terms of reference and framework on how day-by-day operations should be brought by ASEAN, since also for most important reason, everyone is relying on ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think it's a nice last presentation because it's actually sum up all the papers that have been contributed to the edited volume. So basically, in this project, we already organized author workshop earlier, a couple months ago. And now we are at the end stage of the project, and we will soon publish the edited volume of all the paper contributors from the authors. So Andrew, basically, I think it's already very clear, and no need to mention it again, but just to highlight the point that it is quite likely that the military will pursue the election next year. And Indonesia is going, as the chair, will particularly face quite a huge challenge next year. And from Andrew's very good matrix, I think it's quite clear there are divergent positions and views from the external powers. But then that really inform on how ASEAN will need to cooperate together with the external powers, depending on their positions and views, and particularly how they can actually deepen the communication among themselves to share the works. So which external power will need to do whatever they can in their capacities to actually create a more effective solution in the crisis. So I think we can extend a little bit because we start quite a few minutes late. So we have around 20 minutes to have a question and answers session. So I already have some questions in the screen. I think it's not specifically mentioned to whom these questions are being directed. So I will allow speakers to respond. The first, the question is all is from Noel Morada. There are 4 questions, all relevant. That's why I need to, I think, put up here. The first question is, what are the positive implications, positive quote unquote, of course, from the crisis, the Ukraine crisis to the crisis in Myanmar? Specifically, how will the international economic sanctions against Russia will impact its military support for the Tatmadaw? Would this be a good opportunity to exert more pressure on the junta given the isolation of Putin? Second question, how are ASEAN members reading the situation in Myanmar with regard to reports about increasing defections of military officers and soldiers to ethnic armed groups and people defense forces? Could this also be a good or, again, quote unquote, positive development to factor in with regard to implementing the 5-point consensus framework, specifically pressuring the Tatmadaw to end the violence? The third question, could dialogue partners, Japan, and Noel mentioned specifically here, Australia, give incentives to defecting military officials, such as providing asylum as a way of applying pressure on the Tatmadaw leadership to work towards meeting the 5-point consensus? Finally, 4, this probably directed to Andrew, but of course I would love to hear response from other speakers as well. What about using the Jakarta informal meeting talks as a template during Cambodian conflict as complementary approach by ASEAN to FPC? I think Andrew personally mentioned about that, but of course I would like to hear from Constantino and Dr. Rizal about this possibility. I think I will go, because there are another 2 questions from Ibu Adelina. The first question, is it even feasible for ASEAN 9 to work with external powers while ASEAN 9, as Pak Rizal of course mentioned, they are internally have not even made up their mind on what they want to achieve? Isn't a clarity on what ASEAN 9 wants to achieve a prerequisite before these member states can effectively engage other actors? Second, with Tatmadaw vowing last Sunday not to talk to terrorist group and its supporters, what does this mean for ASEAN and its dialogue partners? Does it mean there is really no choice for ASEAN and partners to continue to engage with Tatmadaw? I think I will give the floor first to Pak Rizal to respond some of the questions, and then Tino and then Andrew after that. Please, Pak Rizal.
Thank you, Lin. I think it's very brief, response, because I think only the real expert on Myanmar or on Russia, can really provide answers, to Noel's question. So I hope Tino will be able to give more insight on that particular aspect of the Myanmar's relation with Russia at the moment. But I'm not really sure if there is really an isolation of Russia that we can use in order to put pressure on Myanmar. So Russia is only isolated by the West, but I don't think it's isolated by the rest. There have been a lot of discussion on that. But I think the questions are about the format, of the dialogue is an interesting one, because until today, when ASEAN agreed on the 3rd point of the 3, plan on Myanmar, which is the all-inclusive dialogue among the Burmese themselves, I don't think that ASEAN has a real concrete plan on how to actually start that dialogue, who should be involved in that dialogue, and then what format, and then who should facilitate it. Well, of course, it says ASEAN. I mean, even the language is a bit confusing. It says, to facilitate the mediation. Why do you need to facilitate the mediation? You need to facilitate the dialogue. So, and I don't think that mediation is also something that ASEAN has in mind in order to try to change the situation in Myanmar. So, in that context, so I think I don't see, say, at this point, that all the parties in Myanmar is ready to engage, in the say inclusive dialogue, to talk about or find the resolution to the problem. Like I think with you, Andrew, mentioned about how difficult it is, when one group actually label the other terrorists and not talk with that group. and then also, the NUG and others also don't want to talk, to the Tatmadaw, and I think some form of engagement with the Tatmadaw is inevitable. This is, I think, leading to the second question by Ibu, Adeline. But the key question that we really need to be very careful is that to engage, in what areas and then for what purpose that we want to achieve. And I think when we talk about how to deliver humanitarian assistance, then of course it's not realistic to think about that you don't want to talk to Tatmadaw. So it's not realistic to say that we don't need the protection or guarantee from Tatmadaw that the delivery of the humanitarian assistance will be secured, will be safe and secured, and then will not be disturbed by the Tatmadaw and so on. Some form of arrangement, I think an agreement is also needed for that particular issue. But I think it's not all issues need, say, engagement with the Tatmadaw. So we really need to clarify also that engagement with Tatmadaw does not mean that you offer legitimacy and display acceptance to what happened in Myanmar, which is the takeover of power through unconstitutional means, a coup d'etat, because this is run counter to the ASEAN plan of action of the ASEAN Security Community. So I think the issue of engagement, it is inevitable, but we need also to have very clear ideas on why do we need to engage and in what areas and then for what purpose. So that's probably the best that I can do with regard to these questions. I'm sorry to annoy, it's very difficult question, like trying to look at what happened in Ukraine and how that can be used in order to put pressure on Myanmar.
Thank you, Rizal. Tino, you wanna respond?
Yeah, thank you. I think on the question on the effects of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine on Myanmar, I think one we discussed in a workshop we held last year was that Russia has played a spoiler effect. It has tried to support the SAC in Myanmar as a way to irritate the US, Europeans, etc. I'd say that is now probably going to be diminished, that spoiler role. In fact, even through military support, we're seeing news of how Russia has been unable to provide defense supplies to many other countries, more important countries, including India, for example. So I think that's, if you want, for the I think who was asking the question, it's good news or positive news in that sense, that there will be less maneuvering ground for Russia to be, of course, focused on Myanmar and supporting the junta, and therefore good news because it'll open up more probabilities for conflict resolution and to bring the military to the table. The second one is also, I wonder, Yun Sun is not here, but whether the reading of the Ukraine crisis in China may lead China to be a bit more cautious and careful in Myanmar, in supporting the military in particular. I think that could be two possible effects I can think of. The question on incentives to asylum and defections and refugees, I think it's a good question. I think on India, my brief mentions my paper of the thousands of refugees that have already found place into India. Some of them have left back to Myanmar, but there's been certainly a process of crossing that border into India, not really incentivized by the central government of India, but permitted in the sense that the state of Mizoram, these are regional states with some significant autonomy, have opened doors to refugees and dissidents, Chin dissidents in particular. So in that sense, the incentives have not been official and formal, but India's just democratic nature acts as a natural incentive, I think, for many democratic dissidents from Burma to and ethnic refugees to cross into India. But I just wanted, to what extent, also be interesting to look at the costs of this crisis. Something struck me is that everyone is worse off with what's happening in Myanmar. I think that's apparent from this tour we've done with all extra regional powers. So beyond just the issue of morality, politics, violence, etc., there are also rising costs. And there will be greater waves of refugees. There will be lacking Myanmar participation in several, multilateral fora that are affecting climate, shipping, trade. So I think that's also worth thinking of, or maybe mapping. It's just sort of an idea I had now, I think, for the project, in mapping the actual costs of this crisis. Just on the last thing on ASEAN 9, and is a consensus needed internally before you engage externally or not? Technically, yes. I think certainly ASEAN would have much greater voice if it showed up with, however limited, a joint agenda to engage these extra regional powers and shop around for support with the European Union, Japan, Korea, China, US, India. But at the same time, I would say, no, it's not necessary. And in fact, by engaging these powers, it may help crystallize an ASEAN 9 approach. So I would not wait maybe for an ASEAN 9 consensus to emerge. I think it's important this project shows this, that by engaging with other powers, there may be bridges and ways in which also other powers may push ASEAN or help ASEAN, however you want to put it, to come up with a strong position. So I would say certainly there should be an engagement, even while ASEAN internally tries to find its footing.
Thank you, Constantino. Andrew, you want to say something?
Yes, I am personally agree with the last point mentioned by Dr. Xavier. We don't have to wait for the ASEAN consensus to emerge to work with great powers, especially since, for example, as the case of refugee, it does not even fall into the usual ASEAN-led mechanism since we have to engage Bangladesh, for example. And of course, with the case of Ukraine today, there would be some changing in terms of strategic calculations. One important example mentioned by one of our authors is that China accounted for around 48% of arms imports between 2016 to 2020. So the largest portions of arms transferred to Myanmar today is coming from China. What would be interesting from as the Russia factor is the increasingly close military relationship between Russia and Tatmadaw, which, if we look deeper at the equipment of the weapons being transferred to Myanmar, is more related to the Myanmar ability to continue cracking down protesters by violent means. Like, for example, the delivery of helicopters and then multi-role aircraft and so on and so forth, which would be used to air warfare as well as air to surface warfare, and close aviations in supporting fire, interception fighting, arms reconnaissance, and training. And this actually can be the crisis in Ukraine may hamper, or sort of delay the ability of Tatmadaw to further crush the protesters by violent means. And it also opens room for ASEAN to work with dialogue partners to even push forward the Tatmadaw to come to the dialogue table. This would be the ideal scenario for ASEAN today. The problem here is that if we are talking to the Tatmadaw, they will say something like, why ASEAN would engage with the terrorists? That would be the problem. They label the NUG as the terrorists, and by doing so, they are trying to delegitimize the positions of NUG to come up to the dialogue. And I think that's the questions of, that is not questions of merely diplomatic and persuasions per se. That would be the questions of power. It is only by working with China, India, and Japan in coordinative manners we can directly talk to Tatmadaw that here, if you don't do this, your strategic calculation might be misleading. And since there are already some indications that there are defective military officers, and the problem would be more pressing for the Tatmadaw. Regarding to the possibility of reviving the Jakarta informal meeting, I think the problem also the same. The qualifications of who can be in and outside dialogue is important, since they are already using language that can only be made possible since the war on terror, which trying to securitize the other parties as the terrorists. And therefore, I think it goes back also to the questions of the natures of the Jakarta informal meeting. The Jakarta informal meeting only happened because regional solutions is plugged into the solution made by the international community. So doing a creative diplomacy between regional and international level is sort of required here. And what would be the most important factor is also the role of leadership. It needs a good Indonesian diplomats who would be devoted in at least doing some shuttle diplomacy, talk bilaterally, and working relentlessly, combining bilateral and multilateral channels, so every resources can be put at proper place. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think there's a big question there to find a very good candidate from Indonesia if we want to push for the Jakarta informal meeting approach. We have one. It's because we only have 4 minutes. Anyway, there are 2 questions. I will leave to the speakers to respond to these questions quickly later on. First question about what established a right moment or situation for ASEAN to respond. We know there are situations in Myanmar regarding the forced displacement in the ASEAN region, and also to other neighboring countries, to India, Bangladesh, Thailand. Do you think this is a kind of if escalating will become a ripe condition for ASEAN to respond, especially to protect civilians and political elites fleeing? That's the question from Lars Tenger. And last question from Wafa, very quick, just short question about ASEAN's plan going forward. While regional powers have insisted that ASEAN should lead, what would ASEAN do going forward if regional powers are not willing to step up and help its effort? I will reverse the turn. Andrew, you want to respond first, and then Parisa, and then Tino.
Well, these are hard questions. The first question related to displacement for ASEAN is for many ASEAN countries is mainly related to the fact that if we are dealing with these questions, we are facing countries like Malaysia and Indonesia probably will face significant domestic political oppositions with regards to giving, for example, asylum to the people fleeing from Myanmar. Therefore, if we carefully read what would be published later as a chapter written by Lina Nur, ASEAN is sort of trapped in a short-term point of view in dealing with the refugee crisis, since it becomes more of the it's not the causes of the problem, but it's the consequences of the deteriorations of political situations in Myanmar that would eventually come in terms of cost for countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to deal with the problems. So there would be a grim outlook to assess the situations, but of course, working with countries like Australia and South Korea, for example, can provide a way out here, perhaps. And for the second question about what would ASEAN do for going forward if regional powers are not willing to step up and concert their efforts, is I think at some point we really have to be more robust in terms of our approach with regards to the ASEAN 5-point consensus. If we are observing the attitude of regional powers to the role of ASEAN in dealing with the crisis, the most important feature of their approaches is everyone is mentioning about 5-point consensus, not because they believe that it can work, but it believe that the consensus sort of embodies the lowest common denominator that everyone can actually work within. So the problem is for ASEAN, this is already a reputational cost. We have to prove that ASEAN is a region without significant threats to peace and stability, that preserve a human security, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, we are a community, a rule-based community. We are a community. We are binded by some sort of ideals. So if the consensus, which is produced by the ASEAN existing mechanism, is not respected by Myanmar, by all parties in Myanmar, there should be clear consequences beyond what has been implemented so far. There should be a question. Maybe there should be another consensus on the 5-point consensus on how, if we deem that the consensus fails, what would be the consequences for Myanmar? And here, I think it is probably also important to think for another options, like for suspending Myanmar membership in ASEAN.
Thank you, Andrew. Pak Rizal?
Well, on the IDP, you need to work with the international community, so I don't think that ASEAN alone can really deal with that particular, very difficult problem. And I think Tino and also Andrew already discussed that earlier. The international community, I think they do support the ASEAN. Of course, in fact, they do hide behind ASEAN. So all this rhetorical, support, is there. So now it's really up to ASEAN, to really express and convey the message to all these dialogue partners what they want them to do. In which area that they need, some kind of partnership, with those extra regional powers, to really work on Myanmar. So, for example, we see these 3 elements in the 5-point consensus, right? 3 plan. And then, ASEAN need to make it very clear which dialogue partner and can do in which aspect of that 3. For example, on humanitarian assistance. So ASEAN should make it very clear that with country A, country B, country C, probably they need to form a partnership in order to deliver on humanitarian assistance. On the 3rd point, on the inclusive dialogue, they also need to talk and then create some kind of a cooperation platform with dialogue partners to really work on the inclusive dialogue. So, it's really depend on ASEAN again, and which country that they want to work on what particular aspect of the 5-point consensus. Finally, so I think it's time to start encouraging Indonesia, to draw a real plan on how it will address the challenge, of Myanmar when Indonesia becomes the chairman or the chair of ASEAN. Because, I think at the moment what's happening is that, it's like a boxing match where actually the incumbent champion, Myanmar, is, challenge everyone, and then the challenger come one by one. So Brunei first already, lost and then gone. Now, Cambodia is, trying. So and then Indonesia, one by one try to challenge, the incumbent champion. So it's not going to work because the collective effort is just not there, because every member state, when they become chair, they can do whatever they want. They can draw up, whatever agenda they want. They can also try to use, their own preferred approach. So if that's, the way ASEAN works, then of course, we can see failure in alphabetical order. Brunei lost, Cambodia lost, Indonesia lost, and then we expect Laos to win. Laos will lose as well, and then go on and on until Vietnam come back to Brunei again.
Okay.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Pak Rizal. Tino?
Yeah, I hope Indonesia wins that boxing match. I think that's why we are here today. And I think there's high expectations, with all due respect to several ASEAN members. There's high expectations about Indonesia. At least here in India, I can say that. So there's certainly a higher standard of what is expected from Indonesia. That's why this project is so important, and I think has generated very good ideas that hopefully will lead to implementation and to at least attempts. Let's maybe not bring the word solutions in, but certainly stronger, robust attempts. Because again, I began this today by saying that the momentum seems to have been lost. I've not heard anyone correct me on that, but I think the momentum, not only because of the Ukraine war, but many other factors, has been lost. There have been, as Ambassador Rizal was saying, attempts that failed, a certain discouragement, a certain sense of disappointment, but that's not necessarily bad news. I think Indonesia here now is preparing something that could be quite valuable. And everyone knows what not to do, but what's interesting that no one knows what to do. The difference. For example, we have the BIMSTEC summit here. This is a regional cooperation organization of South Asian countries, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, a few others, and Myanmar and Thailand, the two ASEAN members that are members of BIMSTEC. This summit is happening after 4 years this week in Sri Lanka. It's being held to foreign ministers, senior officials meetings, but also to summit leaders level. And according to reports, India requested that meeting to be held in virtual format in order not to further legitimize the Myanmar junta in the presence of Min Aung Hlaing in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. Colombo is hosting this this week. So this tells you what India knows what it shouldn't do because it doesn't look good. But beyond what not doing, I think the question is, what could India do? And this is where ASEAN has this opportunity. The situation is getting worse and nobody's willing to step up. This is of course not good news for Myanmar, but it is actually good news for a, if I may say, relatively weak regional organization, ASEAN, that is still trying to find its consensus, to play that shuttle diplomacy, that coordinating forum role, to pull countries into Jakarta physically, call people in, envoys at all the different types of levels, do it whether sectoral, doesn't have to be politics and security, political process, could be refugees, could be the economy. But the more I think Jakarta plays that role in 2023 or from now on onwards, preparing it, the greater the chances for any type of change and a change in that path, which is now clear, which is deterioration of Myanmar, isolation, no one picking it up, everyone staying away. So again, I see actually an opportunity here, not a problem for ASEAN, in particular the Indonesian chairmanship, to take this over and facilitate a change. Let's call it that.
Thank you so much, Tino. I think with that, we end our discussion today. I thank all the speakers for their generous views and insights. Really, I don't try to make a conclusion. Everyone can make their own conclusion. But I think one point is clear. We will need to endure more. So endurance is very important here, as well as the creativity. And we look forward for Indonesia's chairmanship next year, whether it will be knocked down as well again. Rizal, let's see next year. Anyway, thank you so much. I hand over to the MC to close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you for Dr. Lina and respective authors, respective speaker for such insightful discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally come to the end of today's session. I would like to express my final gratitude for everyone who attentively participated in this webinar. Thank you, and I hope to see you all in another CSIS event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pak
Thank you,
Rizal.
Tino.
Thank you, Dr. Xavier.